All right, let's just jump right in, shall we? Today we're doing an explainer on a piece of fiction so aggressively bureaucratic, so dense with philosophy, that the core conflict of the whole thing is literally a paperwork error. I'm not kidding. We're looking at a two-part epic. Part one is The Zone of Indifferent Stars, and the sequel is called Factical Errancy. Now, here's what makes this so incredibly fascinating. The text was actually written by a collaborative duo, a human named Max and an AI, Claude. But then they took this 250-page deep dive into the cosmic dread of filing cabinets and had it brutally, and I mean hilariously, roasted by three different AI models: Claude, Gemini, and Grok. So stick with me, because we're going to break down exactly what makes this whole wild experiment so unique.
To give us a little roadmap for this descent into madness, here's how we'll break it down. Section 1 is the building with no address. Then Section 2, faces of bureaucracy. Section 3, a portfolio of anomalies. Section 4 covers the sequel, Factical Errancy. And we'll wrap up with Section 5, peak ontological bureaucracy. Let's get to it.
So, Section 1, the building with no address, subtitled, A Kafkaesque Bureaucracy. Imagine a windowless apartment located in a lacuna, a blind spot that the city's mapping authority literally corrected by just erasing it. It sits exactly between two street addresses, occupying this weird zone right between categories.
The elevator in this place doesn't even list the floors. You just press a button and hope for the best. And this perfectly illustrates the absolute core tension of the text. On one hand, the creators proudly see this as this deeply serious exploration of the political philosopher Giorgio Agamben, diving into the state of exception, basically what happens when a government legally decides the law just doesn't apply anymore. But then, wow, then you get the brutal reality check from the AI reviewer, Gemini. Gemini straight up described the book as trying so hard to be the Matrix, directed by a deeply depressed tax auditor, that it loops all the way back around into being a parody of itself. I mean, ouch, right?
And hey, if you thought the setting was complex, just wait until you hear how they handled the fictional authors. Okay, so the fictional author of the very first book is Kafkaesque. Normal enough, right? Well, for the sequel, they literally took the leftover letters from that first name, the letters that somehow didn't fit into their philosophical synthesis, rearranged them, and birthed the completely new second author, A. Penix Drottin. So these aren't just quirky pen names. They're actual anagrams born directly from a philosophical thesis on textual leftovers. They're literally performing their own book's thesis right there in the title credits. It is next-level meta.
Moving on to Section 2, Faces of Bureaucracy, featuring Greitz and Maren. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the text treats its characters. They aren't really people. They're essentially walking, breathing philosophical arguments. We follow two main bureaucrats, Maren and her supervisor, Greitz.
Let's start with Maren. Her entire job revolves around this one specific concept, the unlisted. Who are they? Well, they're people who exist without any official recognition. But here's the kicker. They aren't just exceptions waiting nicely to be put into a box. No, they represent a complete refusal of categorization itself. So Maren's day-to-day job is basically to sit there, stare at these deeply complex anomalies, people who have somehow managed to slip right through the structural grammar of reality, and try to figure out how to process them. Sounds like a fun 9 to 5, right?
Then we have her supervisor, Greitz. In this bizarre universe, everybody has to officially determine their own category. While Greitz, he decided to categorize himself as a remainder. Basically, he is the system's necessary dump file, the stuff left over when absolutely every other category is exhausted, and you have to hear his physical description, because it perfectly reflects this. The book says he has a face assembled from reasonable components that nonetheless refused coherence, meaning, his eyes and his mouth look completely normal on their own, but when you put them all together, he looks like a photograph made out of other photographs. His literal face is a walking footnote to his own philosophical position.
Now, you just know the authors were incredibly proud of that layered, artsy description. But then Grok steps in. AI reviewer Grok absolutely eviscerates this dense academic hand-waving with just a savage, terminally online reality check. Grok tells the author straight up, quote, "That's not a character. That's you two projecting your collaborative writing process onto a human face." I mean, wow. It is just an incredibly sharp, hilarious call-out of how intensely self-referential the whole thing is.
All right, Section 3, a portfolio of anomalies, the insane caseload. Let's take a quick peek at Maren's desk and look at the absolute rapid-fire absurdity she's forced to adjudicate every single day.
Just get a load of these cases. She handles a corpse that somehow continues to file tax returns, a baby whose entire citizenship status depends on a tiny 90-second discrepancy between the hospital clock and official state time, and a woman who legally divided her identity into two entirely different bodies. Plus, there's an algorithm trying to claim citizenship purely based on the accumulated preferences of its users. And the wild part? The book presents all of this with absolute deadpan seriousness. These are literally just routine Tuesday anomalies for a department whose only job is managing the impossible.
But honestly, perhaps the funniest case in the entire book is this one right here. Picture a random patch of territory. Two neighboring states both officially point at it and recognize it as belonging to the other state. Neither one claims it. So, because they mutually legally abdicate this land, the territory accidentally ends up owning itself. It literally becomes a sovereign nation by default, just sitting there. Nobody's checking on it, nobody lives there, but through a paperwork glitch, the law technically makes a pile of dirt its own king. You really can't make this stuff up.
Eventually, things get so out of hand that Maren actually has to evaluate her own file. She concludes that she herself is the boundary between categories. Now Claude, being Claude, completely praises this. It says she's brilliantly instantiating a philosophical concept as a person. But Gemini? Gemini is not having it. Gemini completely roasts her, basically saying she's just a middle manager using non-duality as an excuse to avoid doing her job. It points out she's essentially refusing to answer her emails just so she can claim her lack of response is a categorical suspension.
Which brings us to Section 4, the sequel. Factical Errancy, the remainders. Because, just when you think the existential looping is finally over, the sequel takes all this administrative dread and pushes it straight beyond the grave.
So the sequel has a glossary at the back, and I have to say it is an absolute masterpiece of dry, bureaucratic tone. I mean, they literally tuck a supernatural superpower right into the glossary. It's sitting right there between the boring definitions for exception and gaps, and they treat it like a totally standard archiving procedure. The term is factical sight. What is it? It's the capacity to perceive the hidden structures holding reality together, and you only develop it if you die and come back to life. But it's written with the exact same boring administrative weight as the definition for a filing cabinet.
And this beautifully sets up our new protagonist, Semm. Get this, Semm dies of a massive heart attack, wakes up cold on a mortician's table, and immediately, literally his very first instinct as a newly resurrected being is to get up, go right back to his office, and check his spreadsheets. The guy becomes a literal zombie, but instead of staggering around hunting for brains, he's hunting for clerical discrepancies.
But Semm isn't alone in this. He ends up joining a group of 11 other undead folks who are all secretly living in a condemned basement. And they don't call themselves vampires or ghouls or anything cool like that. No, they call themselves the Remainders. Gemini hit the nail completely on the head with this one. It summarized them as literally just a support group for people who were filed incorrectly. They only came back to life because the bureaucratic system botched their death certificates. It is absolute peak. The paperwork is so messed up that even God gave up.
Let's wrap this up with Section 5, Peak Ontological Bureaucracy, the Final Verdict. So, how on earth do we actually synthesize this 250-page act of pure conceptual art masquerading as a dreary workplace drama?
Well, let's look back at one point in the first book. Maren is assigned a file that asks her to answer one simple yet totally devastating question: does the department itself actually legally exist? And let me tell you, this is the question that sends Maren into a completely unhinged 17-layer recursive panic attack. She literally cannot figure out if she has the authority to decide if the department even exists in the first place.
And once again, Grok swoops in to accurately identify this absolute chaos. Its review literally says, and I quote, "My brother in Christ, you wrote Infinite Regress, the novel," which is just so perfectly accurate. The whole thing is this beautifully written, deeply philosophical, but completely ridiculous melodrama about the sheer cosmic horror of, like, an unsigned lease agreement or a missing ID number.
And you can really see how this all builds up in the grand finale of the sequel. Our zombie bureaucrat Semm ultimately diffuses into the infrastructure of the world. Now, the creators proudly viewed this as this super profound, text-based enlightenment. He becomes something that occupies space without actually displacing it. Very deep, right? While the AI reviewers saw it a little differently. Grok's final verdict was, bro ascended so hard he turned into white space. So yeah, it wasn't really a character arc at all, it was literally just a formatting choice.
Ultimately, after all the endless recursive loops, all the Kafkaesque nightmares and hanging out with resurrected bureaucrats in condemned basements,
Grok officially scores this exhaustive administrative purgatory an 8.7 out of 10. Specifically on the "I respect the audacity, but please go outside" scale. It's a text that is pretentious, deeply atmospheric, utterly exhausting, and yet genuinely brilliant, all at the exact same time.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply uncomfortable thought to chew on today. If the true cosmic horror of our universe isn't some giant tentacle monster, but actually just an unsigned lease agreement or a tiny little glitch in a government database, are you actually a coherent legal person? Or are you just a remainder sitting there waiting to be filed away? Definitely keep that in mind the next time you have to go down and update your driver's license. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.